This little girl was visiting with her grandmother, Brandy, and her grandmother had presented her with her very first little children's Bible. It was an easy-to-read translation, when she was very young. Now, a decade later, in her teens, the elderly lady was ready to spend a few sweet moments handing down the big, old family Bible to her granddaughter in the time-honored King James Version to this young lady who was her only grandchild. Understandably excited, the youngster was asking a number of questions, both about the family members whose births and deaths are recorded in this Bible, and about various aspects of the Scriptures themselves. Her grandmother was trying to answer all the teenager's questions in terms that she could understand, but one that stopped her cold was this very sincere inquiry. Which virgin was the mother of Jesus? Was it the Virgin Mary or the King James Virgin? I guess I didn't share this one last week. But let me make a note not to do that again. Okay. I'm listening to Tom share in the opening, and he says that we're going to receive a practical message. And I'm looking around at who's going to deliver that practical. What the heck does practical mean? So what I want to share today is some information. This is something of interest to me, and I hope it might be of interest to some of us as well. So I want to look a little bit at some of the science behind truth principles, some of the science behind Lessons in Truth. Remember when we finished Lessons in Truth, we found there are three basic conclusions. Number one, the truth is, God is the only thing that is. The truth is, only God is. Number two, our human thinking, and now I'll own it, my human thinking is the source of confusion, or what Dr. Katie calls error, because God is too big for my mind to grasp in God's fullness, but my mind can't help but try anyway. And number three, to fully experience truth, that is to say, God, God-mind, Christ consciousness, we must let go of the struggle to understand it rationally and to humbly ask God to reveal Himself in and as us now. Last week, we spent a little time looking at the life and leadership of Myrtle Fillmore. And I shared with us that one of the things that impressed me is that even Myrtle Fillmore, Saint Myrtle Fillmore, with all her actual experience with healing, not only her own healing from tuberculosis, which she brought about through her faith alone, seeing the cells in her body as healthy, whole, and complete, but also her work that she then extended for 40 years with Silent Unity, seeing healing happen everywhere. Even she still suffered from doubts and distractions in her commitment to truth. We read a letter that was from her, that she wrote the year before she died, where she talked about her doubts and fears. See if I can find it here. If you are like most of us, she wrote to Mrs. Kent, and I believe you almost hourly think or do something or are moved by some impulse which admits your unbelief, lack of faith, lack of assurance that God is all in all. But we have the Christ mind, and we are all learning to use it, are we not? She wrote to Nellie Wilcox, again, 3 years before she died in 1931. You might be surprised to learn that many of us here who are endeavoring to hear and to heed the still small voice daily, at times have off days when we are not altogether comfortable. This matter of living and understanding the truth is a growth in soul and body. When one is not healed, it is because of some sort of clinging to old beliefs and imperfections or lack of some of the God qualities. So I want to return to this particular issue today because this has been a consistent challenge for me as a truth student in the last 20 years. If this could impact someone as devoted and dedicated to spiritual understanding as Myrtle Fillmore, then not only do I not feel so bad, but it makes me all the more curious about this human experience that she, I, and all of us here, and everybody across the planet that we acknowledged in our opening, share as we are on our human journey. Not a day goes by that I don't find myself aware of being caught up in some old thinking, error consciousness, as Dr. Katie called it. It might be a slip of the tongue that causes someone unnecessary pain. It might be a self-judgmental criticism. It might be a moment of despair from failing to solve a problem successfully because I forgot to ask God's help. Often when I become aware of these excursions that seem to lead me away from truth, I find myself replaying old tapes, repeating negative thoughts and beliefs that have been with me since I can remember. Why, to be open and honest and vulnerable with everybody, I'm sitting here as Tom's doing the meditation and my mind's going, there aren't even 40 people in the room. It must be my fault. Something's wrong with me that this room isn't filled. So that's the way I notice negative mind chatter still in the midst of this sanctuary of commitment to the Christ mind, and there's only God. I still am dealing with this mind chatter. And I just want to show you how complicated this is for me, because I'm also involved, as I've shared with you, at a 12-step recovery program where I and my colleagues work on these same issues that we deal with here. And in that work, I've acquired some very effective tools to help me let God and let go and let God. So between what I've learned from Lessons in Truth and all the other spiritual teachings I've learned in Unity over the years, and from the 12 steps of recovery, you'd think that I, like Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, would have settled by now easily and permanently into enlightenment. Well, you can guess what's coming next. Somehow my mind does not agree. And though I often feel or believe myself to be unenlightened, the truth is that perhaps I, like they, and like all of us here, am actually living in the enlightenment of God mind and unconditional love all the time. Perhaps as a practical experience, here's some practical insights. Enlightenment is nothing more or less than the determination to ask God's help in denying error thoughts, in denying the self-recriminations, the projections upon others, and to ask God's help for loving myself and others without condition or expectation. Perhaps practically enlightenment is the determination to let go and let God whenever I can remember to ask for that. So, as I've studied our human condition, which includes this persistence of error consciousness and the seeming elusiveness of Christ consciousness, I've come across some useful information about our physiological and psychological development that may have some bearing on why this is such a challenge. Many are the areas of scientific learning that shed light on the workings of the brain, the mind, and consciousness. So today, I'm going to share just a few things from a very recent school of scientific investigation that helps me understand a little bit better these challenges of transcending old belief patterns and moving into a higher consciousness. This relatively new science is called the science of neuroplasticity, which looks at the physical structures and dynamics of the brain to understand the relationship between brain activity, consciousness, and our experiences of reality. I learned what I'm about to share from a very remarkable book called The Brain That Changes Itself by the psychiatrist and mind researcher Dr. Norman Doidge, who practices at Columbia University in New York. This book was published in 2007. And I wish I could share all of the remarkable discoveries that he writes of in this book. Obviously, there isn't enough time, so I'd like to just touch on a couple and see what they might lead us to appreciate about this life journey that we're all on. So the first thing that surprised me is that up until 30 years ago, neuroscientists, that is people who studied the brain, presumed that the various elements and regions of the brain were relatively fixed. That is to say that after scientists mapped the brain in the 1970s and 1980s to determine where all of our different physical, emotional, and mental processes reside and behave, they assumed that these various nodes or neuronal regions are set in their ways. That is to say, for example, the visual region of the brain controls the eyes and our visual interpretations. The auditory region controls hearing. The tactile region deals with skin sensations, etc. Now, these various brain function centers were discovered by inserting electrodes that could stimulate a given region of the brain and then observing what the subject who had the electrodes implanted reported, or what brain scans or other measuring instruments could reveal. This is how we ascertained where all these different regions of the brain are and how they work. So the theory of the unchanging brain decreed that people who were born with brain or mental limitations or who sustained brain damage later in life would be limited or damaged for life. Scientists who wondered if the healthy brain might be improved or preserved through activity or mental exercise were told not to waste their time. Using the old metaphor from Isaac Newton's vision of the world, of the machine, that everything is a machine, the conventional wisdom was that the brain was hardwired, and given the enormous complexity and numbers of all the neuronal interconnections in our brains, they were impossible to change. So like a machine, our brain became to be seen as being made up of parts, each one of them in a pre-assigned location, each performing a single function, so that if one of those parts was damaged, nothing could be done to repair or replace it. After all, machines don't grow new parts. So you can kind of think of the original vision of the brain was a bunch of mental gears, emotional gears turning, and if one was damaged, that was it. If you lost your sight, you would never be able to see again. But much like the way we stumbled into quantum physics 100 years or so ago by noticing that classical Newtonian physics wasn't working as predicted, so too neuroscientists began to notice ways that the brain was not acting as expected. So one of those scientists that Dr. Deutsch talks about was a New Yorker named Paul Bach-y-Rita, who began experiments in 1969, so only 50 years ago, that led to the discovery that not only is the brain not a machine of discrete parts and gears, but in fact is one big electrochemical network of plastic and dynamic interconnectivity. That is to say, every element of our brains is connected to every other element so that every neuron, every synapse, every connection is working together as a unified field. His first key insight was that how information gets to the brain was less important than getting it there, and permitting the brain, via the stimulus of new information input, to find new ways of activating its inherent powerful imaginational activity. So his earliest experiments were with helping the blind find new ways to access visual data, or as we would simply say, find new ways to see. So he got this discarded old dentist chair, and on the back of the chair, he created a grid with a series of electrodes, roughly 400 different electrodes, that were tied to a camera and a computer. So the camera's image would be input into the computer and translated into a series of electric impulses that were delivered to the back of the person sitting in the chair by various impulses. So the lighter, this is how it worked, the lighter the visual stimulus in the grid of the image that came into the camera and into the computer program, the stronger the impulse on the back. And conversely, the darker the image, the lighter or less intense the input of the electrode on the back. So the blind person would sit with his back against this grid of electrodes and receive the impulses on his back that the camera and computer were generating. Using this crude, what he called tactile vision device, The 6 congenitally blind subjects that were part of this experiment were able to read, make out faces and shadows, and distinguish between objects that were closer and those which were farther away. Eventually, with practice, they developed a sense of three-dimensional space out of this two-dimensional stimulus. Even though they had never used or stimulated the visual center of their brains, remember, these were people born blind, this new information flow that entered through the skin of their backs was adequate to arouse the brain to create and experience visual recognition for the first time in their lives. Dr. Baki-Rita said, "The brain is able to use information coming from the skin as if it were coming from the eyes. That's because this is the process. Data enter our sensory apparatus and generate pulses along nerves. So that's the way information gets to the brain and is turned into reality. Pulses come through the various senses into the brain, and the brain then generates the patterns, generates what we see or experience through patterns and frequency of these pulses." So Dr. Baki-Rita says, if you can train the brain to extract the information, you can retrain the brain to use it. So the success of his earliest experiments inspired many neuroscientists to reevaluate their presumptions about the brain's capacity to rewire itself. A large body of experimentation since then now leads us to recognize that the brain is incredibly plastic, that is to say malleable, and regularly capable of changing itself. One of the doctors that he interviews says that the way to conceptualize the brain is to think of it as a ball of silly putty that you can move and change shapes. One of those doctors who actually used that image is a gentleman named Paul Pascual-León, who is a Spanish neurophysician who works at Harvard Medical School. And in the 1980s, he pioneered research to explore how thoughts can change the material structure of the brain. His project aimed at understanding the mechanisms that control brain plasticity across our entire lifespan, to be able to modify them for our optimal behavioral outcome. He used non-invasive brain stimulation techniques to modulate brain plasticity, suppressing some changes and enhancing others to gain a clinical benefit and a behavioral advantage for any one of us. Such non-invasive approaches can lead to clinically relevant therapeutic effects in both neuropsychiatry and neurorehabilitation. Dr. Pascual-León believed that the imaginal power of the brain could be consciously harnessed to effectuate changes of habits and health. He discovered that one reason we can change our brains simply by imagining is that from a neuroscientific point of view, imagining an act and performing it are not as different as they sound. They're relatively the same part of the brain is activated, whether we're imagining something or we're doing it. For instance, when we close our eyes and visualize a simple object, such as the letter A, the primary visual cortex lights up just as if we were seeing it. So I want to share just a little bit of one of the experiments that he performed just to give us a sense of how scientists are investigating this. And this involved teaching people how to imagine what happens when you teach people to imagine playing the piano as opposed to playing it. So Dr. Pascual taught two groups of people who had never studied piano a sequence of notes, showing them which fingers to move and letting them hear the notes as they were played. Then members of one group, the mental practice group, sat in front of an electric piano keyboard 2 hours a day for 5 days and imagined both playing the sequence and hearing it played. They imagined playing it and they imagined hearing it. A second, physical practice group, actually played the music 2 hours a day for 5 days. Both groups had their brains mapped before the experiment, each day during it, and afterwards. Then both groups were asked to play the sequence and a computer measured the accuracy of their performance. Can you figure out what's coming? Dr. Pascual-Leone found that both groups learned to play the sequence and both showed similar brain map changes. Remarkably, mental practice alone produced the same physical changes in the motor system of the brain as actually playing the piece. By the end of the 5th day, the changes in motor signals to the muscles were the same in both groups, and the imagining players were as accurate as the actual players were on their 3rd day. This was just one of many experiments that established the primacy of the brain's power to generate imagination as one of its regular activities, and how the brain's plasticity makes it so enormously adaptive to all inputs, both conscious and unconscious. So there's good news and bad news about this brain plasticity in terms of what we are looking at here. Because the plasticity of the brain yields both change and roadblocks to change. Roadblocks because repetitive stimulation of a particular region of the brain strengthens it relative to lesser used areas. In fact, the brain sends support to the most used parts at the expense of those that are not as regularly stimulated. This continued use of the same areas of the brain create tracks or grooves, as it were, that become really efficient at supporting the reinforced behavior. Now, maybe some of you have this experience. I want to share an experience how this works for me. It's called free cell. Or maybe some of you have solitaire. So on my device, I have a free cell game. And what I find is that when I start playing the free cell game, it gives me a little reward when I win. There's a little reward. My brain likes that little reward. So like a monkey looking for a pellet of food, I'm going to play it again. Now what I find is after I do this for a while, I find that I can't stop playing. Because that part of my brain is being stimulated and wants to continue to be stimulated. And what's happening is that energy from other parts of the brain are moving to support the stimulation of winning free cell. Or hearts, which I cheat at because I don't like to lose. But what I find is, over time, and this is actually research that's been done with respect to the internet, started the research earlier with respect to television watching, is that we begin to use screens which produce an emotional stimulus. As we begin to use screens which produce an emotional stimulus more and more, we stop using the functional part of the brain that is stimulated by reading and literacy. So what I've noticed after years and years of using the screen is that I cannot read a book for the same duration of time as I used to be able to because I want to click to something. So the point is the plasticity of the brain can work against us as we're working to change these habits because the brain rallies to that part which is used and moves energy and electrochemical neuronal interconnectivity away from those parts that are not being used, that are being atrophied through disuse. So, what the neuroscientists conclude is that a roadblock of some kind is necessary to help us change direction. If I want to wean myself off the addiction of free cell, I'm going to have to positively put a roadblock against it. According to Dr. Pascual-Leone, our brains are not truly organized in terms of systems that process a given sensory modality. Rather, our brain is organized as a series of specific operations. Operations which process information about spatial relationships, movement, shapes, etc. So when we're learning a new skill, we can recruit brain operators devoted to other activities to support that new skill that will vastly increase the processing power in our brain that's seeking to learn this new skill, but only provided we can create a roadblock between the operator that we need and the function it used to serve. So for our purposes, we can think of these necessary roadblocks as denials. This is the no to the old activity. Affirmations, then, are the instructions to the brain operators to support the new skills that we want to learn or the conditions we want to manifest. So these recent discoveries by researchers in neuroplasticity help me deal with the conundrum that I mentioned at the top of the talk. Why so many of us, including our co-founder, Myrtle Fillmore, indeed including Jesus himself, as we saw when we looked at his experience in the Garden of Gethsemane right before his crucifixion, why we have doubts once we have seen and experienced the truth. These studies explain how our brain physiology works both with us and against us as we commit ourselves to spiritual understanding. It works against us by providing self-reinforcing mechanisms that support error consciousness and all its manifestations. I mean, consider, from our earliest days, in our infancy, in our early childhood, our brains are conforming to the endless importation of sense stimuli so that by the time we are capable of thought, the patterns are already in place. So whatever it is that we've experienced in our infancy and childhood creates the pattern for our belief about ourselves. And remember, Dr. Katie said, it's our belief in error consciousness, it's a belief in what did she call it, the system of the flesh. That's what we are born with. So as I said, by the time we're capable of thought, the patterns are in place, then these patterns then continue to act automatically. In fact, over the years, they keep getting stronger because more and more energy is put into the interneuronal interconnectivity that is supporting error consciousness. And it's going to continue that way, inertially, until such a time as we awaken to a different possibility and we ask for something else. So now, as we make the commitment to opening ourselves to the Christ mind within, the brain's plasticity works with us to lay down the new tracks that respond to our new affirmations, directing new neuronal interconnectivity to support our manifesting the new possibilities that we ask Divine Mind to help us with. So this is what I find, you pardon the expression, mind-blowing. Without knowing this brain science, the pioneers of New Thought, including Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, already knew and could depend on that denials and affirmations work. Now we have the direct scientific evidence that these practices that our founders recommended to us are actually firmly grounded in our biology as well as in our spirituality. So I find it exciting to see the way that the science of the body and the science of mind support and reinforce one another. This shouldn't be surprising once I remember that the body and the mind are in fact a unified organism. So I believe that the ancient wisdom of intuition, I believe that with this ancient wisdom of intuition, that with the support of God we can change our lives, tells us of a truth that's greater than mere physical reality. We can demonstrate the physical truth of it, but there's something else going on. It's because this inner knowing, this intuition that has led us as human beings to explore the exterior observable world. After all, modern science is in fact a product of our ancient spiritual longing to know God. It is this inner knowing that is the source of all our scientific evidence, verifiable, observable, measurable, that's merely reinforcing that which we already knew through our intuition. The word science, as most of us know, comes from the Latin word which means I know, or to know. So modern science came from spiritual science. Now there's so much in this book, and Dr. Deutsch's more recent book called The Brain's Way of Healing, that you might find of interest. So I recommend his work to anybody who would like to know more about the brain science behind our truth teachings. what I find interesting is the most powerful insight of all the recent discoveries of neurobiology is this, that the brain creates and sustains a three-dimensional imaginal perception that incorporates all the input of our senses into a living, breathing, and believable reality. Dr. Deutsch shows, for example, the very act of walking. In the very act of walking, we first create a picture of where our foot is going to go before our foot goes there. So it turns out that the imaginal power of the brain impacts everything that we do. Everything is created as an imaginal picture before it happens. So I'm walking backward, my brain is projecting where I should put my foot, and it's making sure that I put my foot in a safe place. So this power of imagination is actually the incredible gift that we're given by God through our brains so that we can actually know and understand and appreciate that we do make our own world through our minds, that life is lived from the inside out. It's very exciting to me to know that we can verify this through objective science, that which we already knew through the intuitional soul.